When I was a kid, I had a fascination with graveyards, burial grounds, and old churches. I wouldn't call this a morbid fascination, but more of a learning place for a kid of the age of 5 or 6 to explore death and what it means to be remembered by loved ones and friends. As this fascination grew, it led me to the study of local history, which would become a keen interest of mine for the rest of my life. My great-uncle Tom, who was a mountain of a man, as he had worked all of his life as a miner in the local pits, encouraged this interest I had shown in history. And at my behest, after Uncle Tom picked me up from school, we would often take long walks with his mongrel dog Tina around the local cemetery. The cemetery was scattered around the large hillside of the local church on the hill. The church cut quite an imposing presence in the small village I grew up in, as it seemed to loom over the whole place, sitting high above the rows of houses, the local pub, and farms. Everyone in the village attended church at least a few times a week, but at night, it was considered a spooky place to the children in the village. And most of my friends considered me very odd, and often ridiculed me for my interest in the place, and I gained the affectionate nickname, Spooky Stephen. This wasn't a bad thing. It was just kids playing around, and now we are all grown. We often all sit together having a pint in the local pub and laugh about those days. I had my fair shake of pokes at fun at them too when we were kids. There was no internet or game consoles back in those days, so entertainment was what we would make it. The church was ancient and had gravestones and markers now crumbling with the decay of age that dated as far back as the Anglo-Saxon period of Great Britain. This history always fascinated me, and it became a common practice for me to head to the graveyard, most often alone in my youth, and make grave rubbings to find names from the past and look them up in the local archives at the town library. This small library was full of documents, such as land registry papers and birth or death records, which dated back hundreds of years. It was like Google before computers. I would spend hours in there until closing time at 6 p.m., looking through all these ancient records, and when names came up again and again in certain papers, you could slowly build up a picture of someone's life. You could see when they were born, who they worked for, who they married, and how their lives progressed. Most of the older papers ended with people inheriting land or buying farms and making their way as countryside workers. It was enthralling to me. I think it made me realize early in my life that if you say someone's name aloud or read it, that person's memory is still alive. Even at a young age, I found that rather comforting. Listening to this, I'm sure you can imagine I was a bit of a loner. You don't get the nickname Spooky Stephen for being the captain of the football team. No one was ever cruel to me or anything. I was bullied a little for being different, and that was upsetting at times. But I wasn't bothered, and I always just kind of did my own thing. So you can imagine, I was happy when at around 12 years of age, I found a friend who was interested in the same things as I was. One beautiful summer afternoon, while in the graveyard among some shady ancient oaks swaying in the breeze, I was taking some graphite rubbings in a particularly old part of the cemetery, and I met a boy there named Peter. Looking back now, it's strange that I didn't know Peter from school, but you don't think about these things at a young age. Whenever I was in that part of the cemetery, Peter would often turn up unexpectedly and talk to me about what I was doing and why I was interested in these old names from the past. He was full of information and seemed old for his 13 years. He talked about a lot of the old names on the gravestones as if they were still living. He would tell me about Mr. Jones, the Welsh baker, who spoke with such a strong accent that he was hard to understand, and how John Blakely, the town blacksmith, would often let the local children into his shop and teach them how to use the kilns, and pay them a small wage for helping him keep the fires burning good and hot. I checked out all of these names that Peter talked about in the town library, and they were all legitimate people who had lived in the village often hundreds of years in the past. I didn't question this, as Peter would have had access to the same documents from history that I did, but I had never seen Peter in the library, and I was there most afternoons. On another occasion, he told me that he was made to leave school and work from a young age because his father had died in a farming accident, so he had been put to work to help support the family. These times I met Peter were all in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and it was only when I began to get a little older that I started to think that Peter must not be from around here. There was no way a boy of 13 years old would be allowed to work at the hard labor jobs that Peter talked about doing. Dry stone walling or working in the fields are highly dangerous jobs that deal with heavy machinery and chemicals that a child of that age would never be allowed to use in this day and age. But still, I thought nothing of this at first. My young ego thought that maybe he was trying to impress me so that I would be his friend. I started to ask about him at school amongst my friends, and then the teachers, and no one knew who this boy was. I was again ridiculed for having an imaginary friend, so I took a bunch of school friends to the churchyard to meet him, but he would never show when I was with other people. As you can imagine, this became very frustrating and humiliating, so I stopped talking about him. After about a year or two of meeting with Peter on a few different occasions in the cemetery, I began to notice things that were odd or different about him. The clothes that he wore seemed old-fashioned, and unlike me, he didn't seem to be getting any older. At that age, kids grow at an accelerated rate, and I was already almost a whole foot taller, but Peter had remained exactly the same. On the last day I saw Peter in those years, I questioned him about his clothes and the way that he looked, and he took great offense to this. His eyes welled up, and tears began to roll down his cheeks. I told him I was sorry, and that I wouldn't mention this again. He then said to me some words that I will never forget. "It's okay," he said through his tears. "It's been an absolute pleasure to spend this time with you. Just do me a small solid and say my name every once in a while when you are in here. I'd really appreciate that." He then smiled at me in a way that breaks my heart when I remember it, and then walked away into a shady part of the cemetery. And that was the last time I would see Peter as a child. By the time I was around 16 years of age, the local historian knew me by name, and we had developed a friendship, and she began to tell me stories from the past which were not written in any of the history books. Some of the stories she told me were spooky ones, about hauntings and other strange paranormal stories of local legends. Because of this interest she had, and the passion with which she told me these tales of local occurrences, I felt comfortable enough with her to mention Peter. Her eyes lit up, and she asked me to please tell her more. I told her everything, and we stayed together long past closing time, looking up names and histories of local residents, but we couldn't find anything about a young local worker named Peter. However, we did find information in a record about the death of a local farmer in his 40s who was crushed in an accident with his wheat plow in the summer of 1889. The strangest part of the story is still yet to come. Later on in my life, after I turned 18, I was a regular in the village pub and became very friendly with the landlord, and often did shifts in the bar serving in the evenings to help pay my way through college, where I took a bachelor's degree in history. In the summer, for extra pay, the landlord asked me if I was interested in clearing out some of the old attic spaces to get the place ready for an extension that they were going to build. The extra money was welcome, so I agreed. And that is where the most amazing thing happened. Amongst all the cobweb-ridden stacks of books, papers, and a wealth of old furniture, I found a framed portrait from a very old 1890s camera. The picture was of a boy laying dead on a bed of flowers on one of the big old wooden tables in the pub. It was Peter. I rummaged around more, and to my amazement, I found hidden in the back of the frame an old newspaper clipping about the death of a 13-year-old chimney sweep named Peter Robinson. I was not afraid by this, but the revelation came more as a relief, to know that perhaps I wasn't crazy, and that Peter had reached out to me from somewhere beyond our own understanding of this world. I chose not to mention this to anyone, as Peter had never shown himself to anyone else, and it felt like it would have betrayed our friendship that had occurred in those early years of my youth. A few weeks later, I found myself drawn back to that shady part of the church on the hill, amongst those ancient oaks and mossy gravestones, with a bottle of beer in my hand. It was a beautiful day. There was a gentle breeze, and the crickets, birds, and insects chattered in the gentle afternoon. Just like those summer days I had spent in this place as a child, with my Uncle Tom and his dog Tina, who were now themselves long since departed. I rose the bottle of beer in the air and said Peter's name out loud. And for a brief moment, from the corner of my eye, I thought I saw the flicker of a boy standing in the distance in the summer shade, and a smile spread across my face. That day, I learned a lesson for good. That if we think of those who were dead and gone, and remember them out loud, they will live on and never be forgotten.